Hey, this is Mohal Joshi from Los Angeles, California. I follow Indian foreign policy and defense with a special focus on Asia. You can follow me on Twitter at Mohal Joshi.
Hey, this is Kishor from Bengaluru in India. I am an international relations expert specializing in global security, conflict resolution, and international negotiation. My focus areas include peace building and digital diplomacy. You can find me on Twitter at Veggie Diplomat. Hello and welcome to episode 24 of India Rising Strategic Affairs Conversations with Mohal and Kishor, a show in which we analyze the happenings from around the world and their impact on India. 2020 has started with a bang with a lot of happenings from around the world. One of the most impactful among them, if not the most, was the United States neutralizing General Qassem Soleimani, a major general in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and also the commander of Iran's Quds force. So in today's episode, we will be talking about the whole event as such, what transpired before and what happened in the aftermath of the killing, and then the overall impact of all the happenings in the region and also on India. So without further ado, let's look at the timeline of events as to how it all transpired. In general, if we look at, we know that the Iranians have been helping in Syria, and General Soleimani has been credited for fighting against the Islamic State, which is what the US wanted as well, to eliminate the Islamic State both in Iraq and in Syria. But elsewhere outside Syria, like for example in Iraq and Yemen, they were directly pitted against either US allies like Saudi or the US itself, like in Iraq. So if you look at the actual timeline of events, I'll have to take you back to around the month of May last year, May 2019, when 4 commercial ships, including 2 Saudi Arabian registered oil tankers, were damaged in the Gulf of Oman. US and Saudi complained that Iran was to blame. And then a month later, 2 more oil tankers were attacked in June, on the 13th of June, again near the Strait of Hormuz. Again, the same thing happened. The US and Saudi blamed it on Iran. 4 days later, on 17th June, US announced the deployment of 1,000 additional troops to the Middle East. This was again something contradictory to what President Trump always claimed what he wanted. He kept telling that he wants to bring back all the soldiers back home, but the trend on the ground, the reality on the ground, was actually opposite to what he kept claiming. A week, 3 days later, on the 20th of June, Iran's Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps shot down a US surveillance drone with a surface-to-air missile over the Strait of Hormuz. Now, this was a big escalation happening in the Strait of Hormuz, which, remember, carries a large portion of crude oil and is responsible for the global supply of crude oil. And this tension had an impact on the financial markets as well. Within a few days, Trump ordered a retaliatory military strike on Iranian radar and missile sites, but then he quickly withdrew the order, probably because the US was not prepared to carry out such a strike. Now, all went okay for a couple of months, but then again in September, Mohal, you would know that on the 14th of September, the Houthi rebels in Yemen used drones to attack state-owned Saudi Aramco refineries at Abqaiq and Quraish in southern Saudi Arabia. And this attack again resulted in reduction of oil production by half within Saudi Arabia, also leading to destabilization of the global financial markets. So step by step, there was a steady escalation of tensions between US and Iran. And then immediately before the event that we are discussing now, on the 27th of December, Iraqi airbase in Kirkuk in northern Iraq was attacked by a group called Kataib Hezbollah. And this resulted in killing of an American civilian contractor. Now, we all know very well that the Americans never take it lying down. They always try to retaliate and ensure that they have the last word. So 2 days later, there were retaliatory US airstrikes targeting 5 weapon storage facilities belonging to Kataib Hezbollah group. And then a day later, remember that the Kataib Hezbollah is a Shia group. A day later, on the 31st of December, end of the year, the Shia militias attacked and lay siege to the US embassy in Baghdad. Now, this was a serious escalation at the end of the year. Generally, embassies are meant to be off any kind of attack or any kind of escalation. So, the unwritten rule is that embassies are not to be attacked or targeted. But it so happened that the Shia militias lay siege to the embassy there. And again, US was quick to blame it on the group and also its leader, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Now, what happened immediately after that was how the US responded. And Mohal, you want to explain how and what happened thereafter?
Yeah, also like one point I want to add on the embassy siege. I mean, this evoked memories from 40 years ago when the Iranian students during the height of the revolution stormed the US embassy in 1979, exactly like 40 years
7980,
ago.
yes, yes.
Yeah, 40 years ago. So this was like a harking back to the past where such a event had occurred, which resulted in like the US hostages being held captive for like 444 days
Exactly.
consecutively.
More than a year. Exactly, yes.
Yeah. So now coming to the General Qasim Soleimani, I mean, many had mentioned that he was the second most powerful man in Iran. So in the lead up to the events before he was targeted. So on 3rd January of this year, 2020, the general arrived at Baghdad International Airport from Damascus along with Abu Mehdi al-Muhandis and other pro-Iranian paramilitary figures. And they got onto 2 vehicles to exit the airport. Now, a US drone, the MQ-9 Reaper drone, which was loitering above the area, like launched several missiles, striking the convoy and killing the 10 people, including General Soleimani. I mean, so as I mentioned, like he was the second most powerful man in Iran, like more powerful than the Iranian president Hassan Rouhani himself. Now, this was a pivotal moment in the already strained ties between the two nations, probably since the storming of the embassy in 1979. So until now, it was a sort of an indirect conflict between in the battlegrounds, mostly being outside Iran, where the proxy forces of Iran and the US military forces would be in direct combat. Now, well, now, I mean, it is technically still it's outside Iran, but a top guy being eliminated in this manner brings the conflict much closer to home for Tehran. So now, coming to the missile strike, I mean, there are questions like were the United States plain or lucky? Now on Jan 8th, the Iranian responded, as Kishor mentioned, with a ballistic missile strike over the two military bases in Iraq. Now, 15 ballistic missiles were fired at the Ain el Asad airbase west of Baghdad and the international airport at Erbil, the capital of Iraqi Kurdistan. The missiles were reportedly to be a mix of the Fateh 313 and the Qiyam 1 short range ballistic missiles. Uh, just for the viewers' information, like Fateh 313 is a solid engine, 500-kilometer range ballistic missile, and the Kiam one is like a Scud missile without the fins. Now, the U.S. forces surprisingly failed to intercept them, as these missiles were equipped uh, with cluster warheads. Now, if you remember, like Qiyam is the missile that Iran exports to the Houthis in Yemen for which they use in their fight against the Saudis. Now, there wasn't never a doubt that the Iranians would retaliate after the assassination of their top general. Now, it had to be spectacular for multiple reasons. I mean, one was obviously the long-standing animosity between US and Iran, and the huge support for the Iranian establishment witnessed during General Soleimani's funeral. Like, I mean, reportedly there were like 75 people who were killed in a stampede during the mass turnout during the funeral. And also
There were
due to the
reports that they actually had to cut short the funeral procession to
yeah,
ensure
yeah,
that
yeah,
there were no more
yeah.
losses of lives.
And there were like quite a few processions across several times in Iran, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
And then also due to the Iran stated goal to get the United States out of the Middle East. Now, also, like, there was also the credibility issue. Now, if Iran had just been a bystander where one of their top generals was assassinated and they took no action, a lack of action would severely dent the credibility of the regime. So they had to they were forced to take some sort of step, which was a sort of a proportionate response in response to the assassination of the general. Now, some analysts have pointed out that the Iranians were just signaling and didn't want to damage the US assets or kill any US soldiers, and hence their targets were off the mark. Now, this is something which is very debatable. After all, the Iranians were specific enough in their targeting to pinpoint the US part of the airbase, and then the satellite imagery analysis shows that at least 6 to 7 damaged structures. Some of them were obviously temporary in nature. So this was like more than simple signaling. I mean, there was also like some damage, battle damage assessment done by open source intelligence, and it did show that these missiles seem to have quite a significant amount of accuracy. So that appears to be a determined attack by the Iranians to cause some amount of moderate damage to the US assets, and they didn't get lucky, if that would be the interpretation from it. Now, if you, in fact, if you go one step further and ask why these two targets were chosen, it's not difficult to figure this out, because these were the two same bases used to neutralize General Qasim Soleimani. So, in all respects, it was more than signaling. The counterattack had a message, and the message was that if that we eliminated the drones and other assets that you used to neutralize General Soleimani. Now, the Iranians, after the attack, were quick to claim that they had killed quite a few US soldiers in the attack. President Trump denied it in a live press statement the day after the attacks, claiming no US soldier was harmed in the attack. However, as the days have gone by, it has come to light that around like 50 US soldiers have been diagnosed with like concussions, or maybe what the correct term would be, traumatic brain injuries
Mhm.
during the missile strike. And uh, I believe some of these soldiers have even been flown to the Ramstein airbase in
Yes,
Germany
yes.
for further medical treatment. Now, this disclosure of injured US service members indicates that the impact of attack was far more serious than the initial assessments indicated. But I guess Vishal, you'll go into this in further, like, but they were sort of downplayed by the US administration, as it did not want to escalate this crisis any
Mhm.
further.
Yeah. So, yes. So, immediately after General Soleimani was killed, the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution amidst a lot of chaos and din, where only Shia members were present in the parliament at that time, and Sunni and Kurdish members were not allowed inside the parliament building at that moment. They passed a resolution asking the US forces to leave the country immediately, but then that was just a resolution and was not binding on the US as such. But there have been new reports coming in which claim that the Iranians had actually informed the Iraqi armed forces that they would be targeting these air bases and specifically the US portion of the air bases, and the Iraqis would be well advised to stay away from uh, stay stay away from harm. Harm being done to them. So I think this was a well coordinated attack from Iran, taking Iraqis into confidence as well. And Mohal, as you rightly pointed out, President Trump denied it in a live press statement that day. But then, funny enough, during the World Economic Forum meet in Davos, he was asked the same question again, and President Trump clearly indicated that these soldiers did not have any physical damage done to them, were not physically disabled or anything like that, and that these were just simple headaches, and they would go away within a day or two. So again, President Trump, even in the second instance, continued to downplay the actual attack or the actual damage that was done on the soldiers. Mohal?
Yeah, and I think even coming back to the earlier point that I think Iran has mentioned it in, I think, private or public. I remember, I forget which way, but they have already mentioned that wherever the US bases are, if the attacks are launched in from those bases in a particular country, it will hold that country, be it Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or Kuwait, or Iraq, like personally responsible, and they will have to bear the brunt of the Iranian response. So this is kind of trying to preempt any attack being not launched from that country by threatening to retaliate against that
Uh,
particular nation.
yeah, which again gels well with the stated goal of Iran. They actually want the US out of the region, and they would do anything that it takes for them to achieve that goal.
Hmm.
Right.
So now,
Yeah.
yeah,
So,
so
sorry. So, what we will now move on to is what happened after that in the aftermath of the attack on the US airbase. Now, again, the Iranians were quite skeptical that the US might retaliate again. Although the US president had actually downplayed it, telling that for the US, though it was a done deal and they would not attack anymore. But then the Iranians were on their tenterhooks, and they were kind of fearful that the US might still want to attack Iran proper. And amidst all the confusion, we had the sad news coming in from Tehran that that a Ukrainian passenger airliner crashed on the outskirts of Tehran while it was actually had successfully taken off from the Tehran International Airport and was headed towards Kiev. And so, in all the confusion, US immediately pointed out that it was actually shot down. Iran refused and actually denied, saying that it was a genuine crash and it would allow the Ukrainians to come and help in the investigation, crash investigation. But then it threatened the US as well, telling we will not allow the Boeing engineers to come and have a look at the aircraft, nor would we allow them access to the black box. So it was quite clear that the Iranians were hiding something. After all, 2 days or 3 days later, it was quite clear when the Iranians pointed out that yes, it was friendly fire that hit the passenger airliner, and the Iranians thought that it was some kind of a cruise missile coming in from a counter attack by the US that was targeted towards Tehran, and the Iranians, in the moment of panic, pressed the button, and they had a Tor M1 missile which hit the passenger airliner, bringing it down and killing almost everybody on board. Mohal?
Yeah, I think they refused to believe anything other than it being a sort of a mechanical failure. That was the official story being touted by the Iranian media and the
Initially.
government
Hmm.
initially. But I think eventually, like, there were some pictures from the ground where they were showing like warheads of the Tor-M1 missile being pointed out by certain experts. And I think slowly, as more information was coming through, I think they couldn't go with their stated theory of mechanical failure, and they had to admit that they brought down the airliner. Now, one interesting thing was that after the US attack, like unlike what Pakistan did, was they stepped all civilian air traffic going through the airspace because of there could be like a, just to avoid a situation like this where an airliner could be accidentally shot down.
Hmm.
The Iranians, as per some reports, falsely believed that because of the presence of commercial air traffic, the US won't risk any further attacks where the US might accidentally damage or shoot down a civilian airliner. So they thought that the civil aviation flights continuing after their attack on the US airbases would provide kind of a de facto shield from US retaliating due to the presence of significant, but actually it happened the other way around. The presence of civilian airliners uh, in presence of actually being was actually brought down, which caused more issues. And I think this shows more towards uh, the standard operating procedures and the
Hmm.
professionality of the Iranian anti aircraft crews, where they weren't properly trained probably to
Right,
identify and
right.
bring down targets. So maybe in the future, like when such escalations happen, like civilian airliners might just force themselves to ground their planes rather than be a victim of such an attack.
Indeed. After all, there were a lot of Canadians in the passenger airliner, Canadians of Iranian descent, and Canada too was very vociferous in blaming the attack on the Iranian government, telling that the government was responsible for the crash, and that again indicated, and people were skeptical that this was one more step taken in the escalation ladder, and people were thinking that the US might again respond to this. But then surprisingly came the de-escalation announcement from President Trump. Uh, again, people were worried, and they thought that Trump wouldn't want the Iranians to have the last word. But somehow this time he was in a good mood, probably, and he allowed that to happen. So, from the US standpoint, though, General Qassem Soleimani is now no more. He, according to the US, is one of the most dreaded terrorists responsible for the death of hundreds of Americans and hundreds of thousands of others, both in Iraq and Syria, as the head of the Quds force. So, it was quite surprising that President Trump de-escalated so quickly and so categorically. But at the end of the day, it's good that we have some kind of a pause in the escalation, if not a total de-escalation. But from an Iranian perspective, though, they would claim that they had the last laugh by teaching the United States a harsh lesson of not to mess with them in the region. They damaged the US assets which were responsible for bringing down Qasem Soleimani. And again, they have tried to lay siege to the US embassy in Baghdad, and also try to make a political statement by getting the Iraqi parliament to pass a resolution. So I think the Iranians would feel that they have done enough in the entire escalation spiral. And so I think both of them would think that they have some positives to take away from this escalation episode. Mohal?
Yeah, so now what comes next is the million dollar question of on everyone's mind. Now, is this a tactical retreat for both the US and the Iran? Is the worst of this crisis over as of today? Are both the countries committed to a de-escalation, or are we just getting fooled into thinking that this is a de-escalation which might just flare up anytime? So, on from the Iran angle, I mean, Iranians might continue to push their proxies to wage a war against the United States with the intention of getting them out of Iraq and, in particular, the Middle East in general. Now, Iraq is the biggest arena for these two big players. Now, Iraq itself wanted the US to get out of its country, but this was a parliament resolution which was carried out when there was barely a decorum within the parliament. Most of the Sunni and Kurdish parliamentarians were absent when this resolution was passed. In fact, Iraq was so involved in this confrontation that the initial protests that began in October were actually against the high level of control exerted by the Iranians on the Iraqi establishment. It was in one such counter protest that the Iranian backed militia laid siege to the US embassy in Baghdad. The attack on the embassy led to the killing of General Soleimani and the eventual response in form of missile attacks. So now, will Iran rethink their approach of using proxies or waging other kinds of non-conventional attacks? And then also, I might add that the Iranian has like sort of a continuous swath of land which is under the control, if you consider it all the way from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon. So it is has like by its proxies controls a large stretch of land across the Middle East, which I think is posing uncomfortable questions to the Sunni countries and also the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, coming to the JCPOA timeline, I mean, the US did withdraw from the agreement some time ago. Now, the agreement was dead. I mean, Iran was anyway serious about producing weapons grade uranium in violation of the terms agreed to JCPOA. So it is a safe bet to say that Iran will now look to quicken its pace of production of weapons grade uranium to achieve its final goal of procuring a nuclear weapon. Kishore?
Right. I think from an Iranian perspective, when it comes to its nuclear program, Iran knows very well that that the time is running out for them to get proper weapons and missile delivery systems which can actually carry that payload. So I think they would they would get into top gear and focus completely on getting themselves battle ready for a nuke warfare if it actually comes to that. But be that as it may, we'll now have to look at things from a US perspective. It is very, very clear now that the US does not have any political influence on the Iraqi politics as of today. Iran, on the other hand, as Mohal you pointed out just a while ago, Iran is the single
Mhm.
biggest foreign influence on Iraq, and that is the reason why Iran wants the US out of the region. Did US look at the elimination of General Qassem Soleimani as a deterrent? Uh, did the US actually think that Iran will stop just because it eliminated Soleimani? Well, nobody would think that to be true. After all, Iran's top military structure is a well-oiled machine. So if you take somebody out, especially from the Quds force, there would be someone taking his place. So I think the US just thought that it would be neutralizing the Iranian government's destabilizing influence and would want to constrain its aggression, particularly in its support for terrorism and militants. Now, the problem for the US, though, is its inability to second guess Iran's next move. After all, it was not able to guess or it was not able to predict that Iran, through its proxy Houthi rebels, would attack the Riyadh airport, or would attack the Aramco refineries in Saudi, or would attack the Kirkuk airbase, or would attack the US embassy in Baghdad. So I think US has been blindsided in all this and has no clear picture of what is happening in the region. And I think that's the biggest problem that the United States has right now. To add to all the confusion and the complexities, Trump's electoral promise was to bring back US soldiers from the Middle East. However, close to 4 years since then, we actually see the US deploying more and more soldiers into the region in anticipation of a possible counterattack by the Iranians. So I think the problem is not so much for the Iranians. They clearly know what is the end game. And the problem is that the US does not know what it wants to achieve before they actually tell that we are getting out of Iraq. So I think the US has a lot of homework to do before it even commits to a particular policy. Right now, it is totally clueless. So that's about the US. But if we look at the other regional players within the region, we have countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Pakistan, among others. We'll look at these three because they are the ones who actually lobby to the maximum extent. Now, Saudi Arabia obviously does not want to fight Iran directly. The twin attacks on the crude oil refinery was a clear indication that the Iranians were strategically well prepared to deal with the Saudis. Saudis, again, just like the US, seems to be caught on the wrong foot, and they don't know how to de escalate the issue with Iran. Israel, on the other hand, will be particularly very worried about Iran leapfrogging to acquire a nuclear weapon. Its political leadership will try all the tricks in the book to force the international community to stop the Iranians from developing those nuclear weapons. They were successful to an extent when they convinced Donald Trump to walk out of the JCPOA, but but the problem is that there is no other binding limitation on Iran to not go ahead with its nuclear program. So I think Israel also has its hands tied and has no say on what Iran does in the future. When it comes to Pakistan, though, Pakistan would again not want this issue to escalate into a regional conflict. After all, it would get pulled from multiple sides. It would imply that the US attention shifts away from Afghanistan and Kashmir, and US and Pakistan will have to play a tight balancing walk between Saudis on one side, who are their strategic allies, and Iran on the other side, who are their strategic neighbor on the west. So I think Pakistan would not want this escalation to keep becoming more and more complex as each day passes. Also, the other way to look at it is this kind of a shift of US attention would imply that they would get less aid to keep terrorism in check in the region, especially in Afghanistan and the mountainous areas of Pakistan. Mohal?
Yeah, and I think Pakistan did issue a very like they were walking a tightrope of not angering either side with their statement. I mean, they have
I
made
mean, they don't
noises
have
of
any choice right now. That's the only thing.
yeah. I mean, also, like I think some of the fears of uh, the Pakistanis are like coming true, that now they'll be the attention is being taken away from Afghanistan, where they're trying to have US walk
Have a
away
peace
from
deal with,
Afghanistan.
yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm,
Taliban.
mhm.
Okay, so coming to the Indian angle on it now, I mean, if you remember, like in the Pulwama attack on the CRPF soldiers, probably around like a year ago, and the Balakot airstrikes, like they were a retaliatory counter of the Pulwama attack. Now, the most important to point, like, and there are like some similarities, like there was an attack and there was a counter to it. Now the most important point to note here is that General Soleimani's attack challenges the notion that stronger states like should not escalate in response to asymmetric terror attacks, because that risks an expensive war. And I think this has been a fear which was probably overblown by many in the media, and who don't fully grasp all of like the geopolitics and the escalatory ladder systems of how it works.
Mhm.
Now for a long time, like be it India, Pakistan, or like this case, obviously they are not like equivalent in comparison. There's always been a challenge of how do you counter, like some of you might call it gray zone attacks or asymmetric attacks by the weaker power on the bigger power, and the bigger power is sort of constrained because it doesn't want to use its military to directly confront the weaker power, for the fear of climbing up an escalatory ladder which might go out to blow out to all out war. So now in the days after the assassination, I mean, you would hear all kinds of probably, like I would say, like rubbish stories about like World War III breaking out, which has not come to pass. And I mean,
Yes.
both Trump and Iran realize that there is no point of going out for a all-out war. Like Trump knows that he's already, US has quite a bit of commitments in the Middle East, so there is no point of starting a new war. Even though with him, like things are always unpredictable and one might never know which way he might be leaning. And with Iran, they know that their conventional power is severely limited post the sanctions over the past few decades. So it won't be a very good outcome if they, even though they have a sizable military and one of the biggest ones in the, I think the biggest one in the Middle East,
In the region, yes.
uh, they wouldn't fare well if they had to come up against the full force of the, or full might of the US military in the Middle East. So they will still continue to pursue these asymmetric attacks and not go out for all out war. So like in short, like none of the two sides would be willing to actively pursue all out war. Obviously there would be a still a corner case where you could still climb up the escalator ladder which leads to all out war, but I mean it's hard to see that, happening on either side. Now as I said, like basically if you take that into the Indian context, so there was similar fear about the cost and the doubts of the effectiveness of a limited strike by Indian forces after the Mumbai terror attack around like 11 years ago. Now, and something which I think former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Manan had alluded to. Now, the consequences of like the retaliatory response after General Soleimani's assassination and India's retaliatory attacks on Pakistan post Pulwama, and also the remember the surgical strikes 3 year. I mean now almost like 3.5 years ago, suggests that widespread conventional wisdom is mistaken of strategic restraint, as they say. Now, asymmetric attacks do provide the state some protection because it can deny the responsibility for its actions of its client terror groups. But such a deniability will work only as long as the attacks remain at such a low level that the stronger power doesn't seem escalation to be worth the cost. Now, if it crosses certain thresholds of violence, like maybe the storming of the embassy, or let's say the attack on the CRPF Jawans in Pulwama, the stronger state will be able to justifiably respond to it. Now, Iran did cross a threshold, as I said, like when it's the storming of an US embassy in Baghdad. I think many people who were kind of surprised and not following the news when the killing or the assassination happened were like shocked at the US steps, but they hadn't been taken into account that storming any kind of an embassy in any part of the world is a highly provocative step, and so the assassination should be seen in that context and not in isolation as many have done. uh, Similarly, I mean, you could say like Pakistan miscalculated when it launched the attack on the troops in Pulwama, that there would be significant Indian casualties, and India wouldn't take any retaliatory steps, or maybe there would be some of those some surgical strikes across the land border, which they could clearly foil them. So, I mean, in closing, like India would have been justified if he had taken significant punitive military retaliation for the Mumbai terror attacks. Now, the disparity of power means that the stronger power can also decide how to shape its retaliation, which could be either symbolic or could mean to cause serious damage. Now, stronger states can retaliate with symbolic attacks to display the disparity in power. The Balakot was an example where the primary intent was to demonstrate that India had the political will to attack targets deep inside Pakistan. Now, there are obviously limitations, as one should be noted. And in this brilliant piece by Rajesh Rajgopalan in ORF Foundation website, I mean, which points out that India, like, cannot, I mean, I quote, India cannot quote a Balakot airstrike every time a terrorist lobs a grenade in downtown Srinagar, a problem that the US also faces vis-a-vis Iran, end quote. So, like, I mean, this cost benefit equation will be different, like when you have a different kind of small scale attack, like in a different environment. Now, on the other hand, it also limits the effectiveness of the asymmetric attacks as a strategy against stronger powers, because there might be a limit where a stronger power might eventually shred the restraint and also have the uh, attack it, but also similarly bear to uh, absorb these attacks for a long run. Importantly, also the disparity in power means that the weaker side cannot escalate in a retaliation to attack, because this I mean, this is because what happens, like, the escalation could be very well become very expensive for the weaker side, which could just get destroyed, even though there could be a high amount of damage inflicted even on the stronger power. So the weaker side will always have more to lose in this case of going up the escalatory spiral, and disproportionate costs would mount with each step of the ladder, where eventually it could also lead to a total destruction of the state, uh, vis-a-vis the case within India and Pakistan.
So,
Sure.
yeah, since you're talking about the Pakistan example, for how long did they close the airspace?
I think 2 to 3 months, right? If
Mhm.
I'm mistaken, sir.
Yeah, so that is the disproportionate cost that the weaker state will have to pay, and that would negate all the benefits that they would have got otherwise. Yep. So I
Hmm.
think that's in terms of the cost benefit analysis of attack or a counter attack between a stronger state and a weaker state, and how we can draw a parallel between the US Iran escalation and the India Pakistan standoff that we witnessed last year. Now, moving on, I think again from an Indian perspective, we have a lot more to think about. It'll find India will find it very difficult to dance to the US tunes, simply because US had announced that it would have some kind of an Indo-Pacific focus, implying that they would be focusing more on the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean regions. But simply because of the involvement that US has in the Middle Eastern region, US will continue to be pulled into some kind of an issue every now and then. And that would mean that the Indo Pacific would not get the same amount of importance or the same amount of due that it deserves. And India, being at the cusp of both the Indo Pacific and the Middle East, will have to respond and reply in both the situations. So I think India will find it difficult to balance its US ties, whether it is for the Indo Pacific focus or focus on the Middle Eastern region. Also, in addition, I think India will find it difficult to have a proper, measured, and calibrated Afghanistan strategy. I mean, remember that some kind of a connectivity between India and Afghanistan is very key, is key for India to have a sustained cooperation and sustained trade happening between itself and Afghanistan. So every time US relaxes or tightens the economic sanctions against Iran, there will be great uncertainty on the Chabahar project and the
Mm-hmm.
eventual connectivity that India wants to establish with Afghanistan. I mean, the reality is that they want us to extend all the way into Central Asia, but nobody is even talking about it right now. When you can't have a dedicated corridor to Afghanistan, why do you have to worry about Central Asia? So I think
but but
that's
but
the
they have
kind of
given us a exception for the
right.
sanctions where
Exactly. So all this, that kind of a promise or that kind of a approval was given by the US during the 2+2 dialogue that happened in Washington D.C. in the winter. But immediately after that, this escalation happened. So I doubt if the US would still want to allow India to continue working with Iran as if it was business as usual. So I think India will want to be a little more careful on how it wants to handle this issue, and may not want to piss off US, but at the same time want to be seen by the Iranians that India is not somebody who would switch over to the US side. So I think India will have to do some amount of tightrope walking. I think the other big worry for India, Mohal, would be for how long and to what extent would the US want to involve itself in the Middle East. If the US, as I indicated earlier, is not in control of what it wants to achieve in the Middle East, it leads to more and more uncertainty, and this affects the geopolitics and the geoeconomics for India. After all, we all know that 8.5 million Indians work in the Gulf region, and their security will be a big worry for New Delhi. Similarly, Middle Eastern region is the biggest source for India's energy needs, and the uncertainty will have an impact on India's energy needs. So this kind of a balancing act that India will have to do, and also have some kind of a far-sighted approach to the Middle Eastern region in general, will mean that India cannot focus on other regions and will be kind of blindsided most of the time. As I told, both of them are strategic allies for India for different reasons. And unlike how US views the world, India cannot look at it as its, India cannot look at Iran as if it's a terror state. And that therein lies a big difference between how the US views the region and India views the region. On a side note, though, Mohal, I want to quickly bring out something that I noticed. The Patriot air defense missile batteries, if you remember, were actually stationed in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the region. And they were designed with the capability to intercept short range ballistic missiles. And the point is that they failed to defend the Riyadh International Airport when the Houthi rebels launched the Fateh and Qiyam missiles on the Riyadh International Airport in 2019. And many people thought that it was the inefficacy of the Patriot air defense system which actually led to such widespread damage of the Riyadh airport. And again, this time around, though, in the Ain al Assad airbase, somehow the Patriot missiles were not deployed. Now, the question is, was it a simple logistical issue, simply because the air defense system cannot be present at all the places at all the time? Or was it because the Patriot air defense missile system was not good enough? This has been some kind of a question that is being raised right now. And the point that I want to draw here is that US wanted Indians to purchase Patriot, or at least consider that, or the third air defense system that US has on offer. And they did not want the Indians to go ahead and purchase the Russian S-400 air defense system. Mohal, we've actually covered this quite in detail in our earlier podcast. So I think this is one thing that there will be a lot of talk happening on the efficacy of Patriot, and there may be some amount of hush hush happening within the Indian strategic circles, wherein somebody might point out, telling, "Hey, you know what? This is one of the reasons why we didn't go ahead and purchase Patriot." So that's something that we might hear something about in the near future. Mohal.
Yeah, so very well summed up on the implications for India. So now that brings us to the end of the discussion for this week. So, like listeners, we do recommendations for on in every episode. So, Kishore, switching to our recommendations for the week, do you want to share anything that you read which is worth recommending to our listeners?
Yes, actually, while digging up and researching for this episode, I was reading quite a bit about the Qiyam missile that Iran used to blast the US airbase. And I realized that it was the same missile that the Houthi rebels had also used when they attacked the Riyadh airport. So Qiyam in itself is quite a potent weapon that the Iranians have, and it has also been proliferated. And there have been non-state actors like the Houthi rebels who also have them in their arsenal right now. And the article that I read was one such that was published by National Interest, nationalinterest.org, and I would recommend that article for our listeners. Mohal, you have any recommendation for this episode?
Yeah, I have the piece by Rajesh Rajgopalan,
Mm-hmm.
which basically uh, looks at the current escalation between the US and the Iran, and compared it to the India and the Pakistan angle
Mm-hmm.
that happened between the Pulwama and the
Right.
Balakot episodes, and just look at the small state and the large state dynamics when the small state is trying to be in a doing asymmetric warfare against a larger state, and what should be the response be from a larger state. So it's a very good piece to read on the dynamics between large state and small states. How do they go about dealing with each other in terms of violence and escalation.
Yes, that's a fabulous read, Mohal.
So with that, listeners, we have come to the end of this week's episode, where we covered in detail the latest round of US-Iran rivalry and its impact on the Middle East region and also on India. To continue hearing about such interesting topics, do subscribe to our channel India Rising wherever you are listening to us. If you have not left us a review, we urge you to do so, as it helps other listeners like you in finding us. We also would like to hear from you if you have any suggestions on any topics that you would like us to cover. Do remember that these topics should be directly related to Indian foreign policy. Until the next time, this is Mohal and Kishore signing up.